Well, I think we're all aware that it is July, and we're now in the middle of our season for family vacations. The kids are out of school, and it's time for a trip to Disney or to the mountains or anywhere other than here. Unless, of course, you're planning a staycation. Now, if we were British, we wouldn't be planning a vacation at all. We'd be planning a holiday. Marilyn and I stream a lot of shows on Acorn. I know you've not heard of it, but that's where we stream a lot of shows. And they give us access to British shows and British humor, which we generally enjoy. And they often speak of going on holiday, as do Theo and Rose in Jamaica. When I wondered why they call a vacation a holiday and Googled the question, I got the answer. Brits call a vacation a holiday because the term originated from holy days in the Middle Ages. These religious festivals were practically the only days off commoners received. Over time, the concept evolved to describe any allocated time off from work or school, regardless of whether you are religious, traveling, or just staying home. Americans go on vacations. We vacate our homes for a week or two. But are we missing the point of a holiday? We often come home from vacations worn out and in need of rest. Maybe it's time to reclaim our holidays and let them be what God intended them to be. And yes, God did give us holidays, but they weren't just occasional affairs. A weekly holiday was included in the law as a day of rest. In Exodus 20, 8 through 11, we read, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." The Sabbath was a gift, a holy day, a day to rest from our labors and to simply enjoy the goodness of our God. But it wasn't long until the holy day lost its primary purpose, and what God gave as a blessing evolved into a curse. Greedy men and women thought it a wasted day and made it just another day to serve the god of Mammon. And religious leaders wrote rules and regulations that turned it into a burdensome day of religious obligations. They lost their holidays, and we may have as well. But perhaps we can reclaim our holidays by changing the way we approach them. And in our text for today, we see 3 approaches to the Sabbath. And I believe we can learn something from the way the disciples, the Pharisees, and the servant approached the holy day. We begin with the disciples' approach. We're in the 12th chapter of Matthew. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath through the grain fields, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Behold, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It was a Sabbath day, most likely early afternoon. Jesus' disciples had no doubt been to the synagogue, as was their custom, and were probably headed home to spend the rest of the Sabbath day resting. They were walking through a grain field, and as they were walking, the disciples picked a few heads of grain to eat. It was an innocent act. They were hungry, and the law said it was permissible to pluck a few heads of grain from your neighbor's field. You couldn't wield a sickle and harvest it, but you could eat a little. But this was the Sabbath. And the disciples probably knew the Pharisees would consider what they did to be working. Harvesting, plucking the heads, threshing as they rubbed the grain to loosen the chaff, and winnowing as they blew the chaff away. But they weren't working. They were just snacking on a few fresh grains, and Jesus didn't care. But then again, his attitude toward the Sabbath was not like that of the Pharisees. And sure enough, the Pharisees saw it and confronted Jesus with his disciples' despicable behavior. Behold, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath. I do find it interesting that the Pharisees held Jesus responsible for the behavior of his disciples. And I can't help but wonder how often Jesus is criticized for the behavior of his disciples today. Be that as it may, when Jesus was confronted about his disciples working on the Sabbath, he defended them. And he did so by exposing the Pharisees' ignorance of history, the law, and the prophets. Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he asked? He took them back to the time when David was a fugitive running from a jealous King Saul. How David stopped at Nob, where the tabernacle was located, and asked Ahimelech the priest for 5 loaves of bread. Ahimelech said all they had was the consecrated bread from the table of showbread. The law stated that 12 loaves of bread were to be placed on a table before the Lord continually. They were changed on the Sabbath, and when removed from the table, they were to be eaten only by the high priest and his family. But due to David's urgent request and his need, Ahimelech gave David the bread that was unlawful for him to eat. What did the Pharisees think of that? And what about priests who worked on the Sabbath? Priests were commanded in the law to stoke fires, slaughter animals, and minister before the Lord on the Sabbath in violation of Sabbath day regulations. How did they resolve that dilemma? Had they even thought it through? Well, I have. And whenever someone asks me if it's okay to work on Sunday, my standard response is, I do. Jesus then went to the prophets and pointed out that they apparently didn't understand what Hosea meant when he spoke for God and said, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice. In effect, Jesus appealed to a king, the priest, and the prophet in defending his disciples, and in doing so made it obvious they were innocent. They weren't flaunting the laws of God by eating a few grains on the Sabbath. They were simply responding to their hunger and were enjoying the provision God had made in his law for taking a few grains from a neighbor's field. They weren't working, but even if they had been, it would have been acceptable. They may not have been serving in the temple like priests did on the Sabbath, but they were doing something greater. They were following and serving the Lord of the Sabbath. And as Hosea had made clear, he's more concerned about a man's heart, his compassion, than his external observances, his religious sacrifices. The disciples' approach to the holy day was one of innocent enjoyment and heartfelt service. What could be wrong with that? Certainly, it was better than the Pharisees' approach. We continue. And departing from there, he went into their synagogue. And behold, there was a man with a withered hand. And they questioned him, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" In order that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "What man shall there be among you who shall have one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. But the Pharisees went out and counseled together against him as to how they might destroy him. Now, Luke makes it clear that this is another Sabbath day. The Pharisees have had time to consider what Jesus had said, but obviously they weren't open to what he had to say. They were the teachers of the law, and he had made them look foolish. He had exposed their ignorance, and now they wanted to get back at him. In the synagogue that day was a man with a withered right hand, and tradition tells us he was a stonemason who had been injured on the job and was now unable to provide for his family. The Pharisees figured Jesus would do something to help this man. Some have even suggested they planted him in the congregation to entrap Jesus. Whatever the case, they were watching. They were waiting for Jesus to do something they could use against him. Finally, they grew impatient and asked, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered by asking them a question. "If you had a sheep and it fell into a pit on the Sabbath, would you lift it out?" Now, scribal law did address such a situation. It said if the animal wasn't injured, they could merely lower food and water to it. But if it was injured, they were allowed to retrieve it. So yes, they could rescue an injured animal on the Sabbath. But something more valuable than an animal needed help that day. Men are made in the image of God, and that makes any man worth more than any animal. And Jesus made that very clear, of how much more value then is a man than a sheep. He wasn't asking a question, he was making a declaration. Men are much more valuable than sheep or plants or rocks or anything else God has created. So yes, a man could be healed on the Sabbath, and Jesus proceeded to do so. Mark tells us that he told the man to rise and come forward. And then, looking around at the Pharisees with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." When he did, it was healed. And the Pharisees were furious. Jesus hadn't even touched the man. He hadn't done anything they could define as work. But they knew he had healed them. They left the synagogue and counseled together. They had to come up with some way to get rid of this Sabbath-breaking nonconformist. If they didn't do something and do it quickly, who knew how many people would start accepting his ideas? And what would become of their sacred traditions? You see, it wasn't enough for them to personally be bound by legalistic traditions on the holy day. They felt everyone had to be bound by the same laws and regulations and traditions as they, and they were threatened by any who weren't. They didn't understand the freedom we are to have in worship and in service. They didn't realize what Paul would spell out in the 14th chapter of Romans, that it's okay for one man to regard one day above the other and for another to regard every day alike, if both are doing so for the Lord. They were doing exactly what Paul warned the Colossians to watch out for, telling them to let no man act as their judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. They had, in fact, done what Paul cautioned the Galatians not to do. They had become enslaved to the weak and worthless elemental things, like the observance of days and months and seasons and years. In their attempt to honor God on a holy day, they had dishonored him by enslaving his people to external observances that took the joy out of their holiday. And not only that, they were seeking to destroy the Lord of the Sabbath so they could observe the Sabbath the way they wanted. Pharisees, however, aren't only found in the religious community. Anyone seeks to mandate what can and can't be done on a holiday is following the Pharisees' approach. So there's another approach we need to see. But Jesus, aware of this, withdrew from there, and many followed him, and he healed them all and warned them not to make him known, in order that what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, "Behold, my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon him, and he shall proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A battered reed he will not break off, and a smoldering wick he will not put out, until he leads justice to victory. And his name, the Gentiles will hope." Jesus knew the Pharisees wanted to kill him, and he knew eventually they would succeed. He had, in fact, come to earth to die for us. But for now, he had other things that needed to be done. So he avoided further confrontation by withdrawing. But a crowd followed. And of course, he healed those in need of healing. He did warn them, however, not to say anything that would further stir up the religious authorities against him. It wasn't time for the final confrontation. For now, he was simply fulfilling what Isaiah had prophesied in the first of 4 servant songs found in the book of Isaiah. The ones we are most familiar with are the songs of the suffering servant, found in Isaiah 52 and 53. This one, found in Isaiah 42, tells of the servant's attitude toward his ministry. His desire was to be well-pleasing to his Father. And with the Spirit's power, he would proclaim justice to the Gentiles, to the nations. He would not, however, quarrel or get into loud arguments in the streets. He wouldn't fight and crush his enemies, at least not now. Even though he was humiliating the religious leaders, he wasn't out to destroy them. They were like battered reeds after confronting him, but he didn't want to break them off. They weren't the lights they had once been, but he wasn't here to extinguish their flame. He hadn't come to bring judgment, but hope. He would proclaim justice at his first coming. Judgment would wait until his second coming. His current mission was to bring hope and rest. And that was God's intent in giving us the Sabbath. The holy days, the holidays, were given as gifts to give us rest and hope. They weren't given to give us something to fight about or a way to judge one another's faithfulness. There was a day when businesses were closed and no sports were played on Sundays, which some consider to be the Christian Sabbath. And there is a renewed interest in setting aside a day of rest in our hectic world. Charlie Kirk's last book was entitled "Stop in the Name of God: Why Honoring the Sabbath Will Transform Your Life." Charlie not only rested on the Sabbath, he turned off his phone on Friday night and didn't turn it back on until Saturday night. Taking a break from phones and social media for a day is no doubt a good idea, but it's not something we should impose on others. It's not our place to argue in the church or on the streets what should or shouldn't be done on the Sabbath or on any holiday. Yesterday we celebrated the 4th of July. And this year, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the founding of our nation. Many disagree with the way the president would like us to celebrate. But I think we can all agree that God has blessed us as a nation for 250 years, and pray that our country will continue being one He can bless for at least another century or two. Holidays, festivals, and celebrations should be times of hope and joy and peace. And we can make them that way if we will approach them the way the disciples and Jesus did and not get caught up in religious or political arguments. Let's be done with a combative spirit that's always looking for someone or something to criticize. Let's not let God's gifts be reduced into something He never intended them to be. Let's spend every holiday, every holy day in the company of our Lord, and let's enjoy our times of celebration and rest together. The key to reclaiming holy days is taking time to be holy ourselves. And we do that by letting the world rush by as we spend time with Jesus, feed on His Word, and make friends with God's children. Amen. Let's stand.